Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at a crossroads in our nation's history, at a juncture where the pillars of democracy, truth, and unity are increasingly challenged. We gather here today not merely to discuss the events of January 6, but to probe deeper, to unravel the complex tapestry of media influences that shaped this tragedy and continue to shape our collective consciousness. Now, historically, the media has served as the fourth estate, an independent watchdog of power. However, the landscape, well, it's changed drastically over the years. Noam Chomsky once wrote in his seminal work, Manufacturing Consent, the system, the media... Okay, God... Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at a crossroads in our nation's history, at a juncture where the pillars of democracy, truth, and unity are increasingly challenged. We gather today not merely to discuss the events of January 6, but to probe deeper, to unravel the complex tapestry of media influences that shaped this tragedy and continue to shape our collective consciousness. Historically, the media has served as the fourth estate, an independent watchdog of power. However, the landscape, well, it's changed quite dramatically over the years. Noam Chomsky once wrote in his seminal work, Manufacturing Consent, the mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace, end quote. Yet today, one might wonder exactly what these messages are and who truly benefits from them. The cracks in our media foundation have been widening for years, fueled by three main drivers: corporate ownership, the consolidation of news outlets, and the unabashed politicalization of news. All three, of course, dancing to the tune of profitability. It's important to reflect on what Walter Lippmann, a noted journalist and commenter, once said. There can be no higher law in journalism than to tell the truth and to shame the devil. But the marriage of media to corporate ownership somewhat challenges this ideal. As CBS President Leslie Moonves candidly noted regarding the 2016 election, quote, "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS," end quote. Such a sentiment, stark in its honesty, underscores the battle between profit and truth. When a company's bottom line dictates content, sensationalism is of course going to eclipse substance. Consolidation further complicates matters. Ben Badikian, in his groundbreaking book, The Media Monopoly, warned about the chilling effects of media consolidation. He noted that as fewer corporations control increasing portions of the media, there's a potential loss in the richness of discourse. His predictions were quite astute. Today, only a handful of corporations dominate our media ecosystem. They dictate not only what is news, but also how it's presented, creating a homogenized and often sanitized narrative. And then there's the politicalization of the media. As media mogul Rupert Murdoch once observed, the world is changing very fast. Big will not beat small anymore. It will be the fast beating the slow. In the rush to be fast, to be first, accuracy, well, that's often the first casualty. But more than speed, news today caters to echo chambers, serving not the broader populace, but targeted ideological segments. The confluence of these forces against the backdrop of the digital age is profound. When combined with the online realm, the polarization in mainstream media becomes amplified manifold. Eli Persner in The Filter Bubble speaks of the insular echo chambers online. He says, quote, "You go online and you see your kind of people, links to what you already want to know, and feeds from those you already want to hear from. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Polarized mainstream media feeds polarized digital content, which in turn shapes the former. January 6 cannot be viewed in isolation. It is the culmination of these parallel realities, the explosive intersection of disinformation from both mainstream media and digital platforms. So I guess the question here is, where do we go from here? Well, the road to media redemption and restoration is twofold: systemic change and individual responsibility. We must advocate for greater transparency in media ownership, pushing for regulations that ensure diversity in ownership and consequently diversity in perspectives. Nicholas Johnson, a former FCC commissioner, once said, "All our media are controlled by large corporations that have an overriding interest in selling something." Recognizing and counteracting this, well, this is our collective challenge. Education, as always, is pivotal. Media literacy should be woven into the fabric of our educational systems. As Noam Chomsky advised, quote, "Citizens of the democratic society should undertake a course of intellectual self-defense to protect themselves from manipulation and control," end quote. In other words, we must be armed with the skills to discern fact from fiction, genuine reporting from corporate PR. But beyond systemic measures, our individual roles are paramount. James Madison once said, quote, "A well-instructed people alone can be permanently a free people," end quote. This instruction isn't just academic. It's the continuous self-education in seeking varied news sources, in challenging our biases, and in engaging with diverse perspectives. January 6th, in all its grimness, offers us a silver lining. It's our moment of awakening, our call to reaffirm the values of truth, unity, and democracy. We're at the cusp of change. Let's ensure that it's a change for the better, to forge a future where media enlightens rather than divides, where truth triumphs over sensationalism, and where our democratic ideals shine brighter than ever before. Let's dive a little deeper into January 6th. This dark chapter in American history isn't merely a reflection of our nation's deep divides. It's emblematic of the intricate dance between events and their representation in the media. Now, one would think that in an age of information abundance, clarity would of course prevail. Yet, as Aldous Huxley wisely observed in his classic work, Brave New World, facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored. And in the aftermath of January 6th, well, we find ourselves entangled in a web of narratives, half-truths, and even blatant misinformation. How exactly does an event, witnessed by millions, both on the ground and through screens worldwide, become so shrouded in misrepresentation? Well, the answer, it's as complicated as it is concerning. First, consider the immediate responses. The Capitol Hill incident was barely hours old when multiple narratives began to emerge. Now, on one hand, some media outlets portrayed the event as a passionate, albeit misguided expression of democratic dissent. Others, however, depicted it as nothing short of an orchestrated insurrection. So what's the truth? Honestly, it's somewhere in between. Historian Timothy Snyder, in an interview with The New Yorker, stated that post-January 6th, quote, "We have to defend the basic institutions of democracy, while adjusting to the fact that we've been living in a fictional world," end quote. Now, this fictional world is a realm where events are twisted, reframed, and sometimes even wholly recreated to fit pre-existing biases and agendas. But this isn't just about media outlets bending narratives. Politicians, too, both on the left and the right, quickly weaponized January 6th for their partisan battles. Some sought to downplay its significance, even as others amplified every minor detail to further demonize their opponents. Now, both tactics, while politically expedient, well, they do a grave disservice to the truth and to those who genuinely seek understanding. Edward R. Murrow, one of the pioneering figures in broadcast journalism, once said, quote, "The speed of communications is wondrous to behold. It is also true that speed can multiply the distribution of information that we know to be untrue," end quote. Now, this is particularly evident in the age of social media. Misrepresentations about January 6th, from the motivations of the participants to the reactions of law enforcement, were both widely disseminated, each version more distorted than the last, shared and reshared until fiction began masquerading as fact. Add to this the emotional weight of the event. Emotion, powerful and raw, often clouds judgment. As Maya Angelou once observed, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel, end quote. The visceral reactions to January 6th, fear, anger, disbelief, have further muddied the waters, making objective understanding even more elusive. So how do we navigate this quagmire? The path to clarity begins with acknowledging the inherent biases in media consumption. As consumers of information, we must recognize the sign of media manipulation. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges rightly points out in his book Empire of Illusion, quote, "We bought into the idea that image is reality, and that if it looks real, it is real," end quote. We must challenge this notion, probing deeper than surface-level presentations, seeking out primary sources, and critically evaluating every piece of information. Now, of course, the onus isn't just on us, the consumers. The media industry itself needs introspection and reform. Journalists and editors must revisit the age-old tenets of the profession, prioritizing accuracy over speed and substance over sensationalism. As the legendary journalist Bob Woodward advises, quote, "The effort to separate the truth from falsehood is really the task of a lifetime," end quote. And in this era of unprecedented information warfare, friends, this task becomes even more critical. Similarly, politicians on all sides must recognize the long-term damages and dangers of short-term political gains that is achieved through misinformation. Using events, especially ones as significant as January 6th, for political point scoring erodes public trust and deepens societal chasms. As Abraham Lincoln wisely noted, quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," end quote. Finally, we as citizens must endeavor to rebuild bridges. It's not about agreeing on everything, but about understanding different perspectives, even when we disagree. Howard Zinn, the renowned historian, once remarked, quote, "You cannot be neutral on a moving train," end quote. Today, as our society hurtles forward on a train of rapid change and polarization, neutrality, quite simply, might not be an option. But informed, empathetic, and constructive engagement certainly is. It is essential to understand that January 6th isn't merely a date, an event, or a footnote in history. It's a stark reminder of the fragile nature of truth in our modern age. It underscores the dire need for a renewed commitment to transparency, integrity, and unity. As we reflect upon it, let's pledge to rise above partisan divides and endeavor to foster a society where truth triumphs, where unity prevails, and where the ideals of democracy shine brighter with each passing day. In our quest to understand, process, and act in this age of ubiquitous information, media literacy emerges not merely as a tool, but as an indispensable skill. It is a compass for navigating the ever-turbulent waters of the information ocean, enabling us to discern the currents of truth from the whirlpools of deceit. Firstly, let's articulate what media literacy means. According to the National Association for Media Literacy Education, media literacy is the ability to, quote, "access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication," end quote. Quite simply, it's the know-how to critically interact with media content, recognizing the nuances and biases and underlying intentions. So why is media literacy so vital? Well, legendary journalist Carl Bernstein puts it secondly, the lowest form of popular culture, lack of information, misinformation, disinformation, and a contempt for the truth or the reality of most people's lives, has overrun real journalism, end quote. Today, that onslaught is evident everywhere, making media literacy not just desirable, but utterly essential. Number one, we have to understand the media's purpose. Every piece of media, whether it's a news article, a TV show, a tweet, a podcast, has a purpose. That purpose could be to inform, entertain, persuade, or even deceive. By recognizing this purpose, you can better assess the value and veracity of the content. Remember what the great George Orwell said, quote, "Journalism is printing what someone else does not want printed. Everything else is public relations," end quote. Number two, check the source. Is the source of the information reputable? Are they known for rigorous fact-checking or merely chasing sensationalism? The onus of verification, as journalist Brooke Beninsky reminds us, is on everyone. Quote, there is no gatekeeper anymore. Remember, the power and the responsibility are in the hands of the beholder. End quote. Number 3, cross-reference information. One of the golden rules of media literacy is to never rely solely on one source. Cross-referencing allows you to identify consistent facts and dispel anomalies. As esteemed journalist Linda Ellerby remarked, in the news business, you always have to be skeptical without being cynical. Number 4, recognize emotional manipulation. Media often capitalizes on feelings. Engaging an audience's emotions is a potent tool to sway opinions and to shape narratives. But as responsible consumers, we should be wary. Being moved by a piece isn't the problem. The issue is when our emotions cloud our judgment. As activist Rebecca Solnit wisely notes, quote, being able to state facts and argue from values is a baseline that's slipping away, end quote. Number 5, understand the economics. Media outlets, online platforms, and even individual content creators often rely on revenue from advertisements, subscriptions, or clicks. Recognizing their financial motivations can help decode why certain content is promoted or framed a certain way. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Bill Dedman cautioned about the digital age, saying, quote, click and ye shall find, end quote, implying that the rush for clicks can sometimes overshadow genuine journalism, as those who stand to profit lure consumers by dangling a promise of information that has been skewed to their target's preferred belief system. Number 6, analyze the craft. From headlines to image choices, every element of a news story is meticulously crafted. By understanding these components, why a particular headline was chosen, why certain images lead a story, well, you can gain a deeper appreciation and skepticism of the narrative that is being presented. Number 7, engage in dialogue. Media literacy isn't a solitary pursuit. It's a community endeavor. Engage with friends, family, and peers. Listen to their perspective and share yours. This mutual exchange can unearth biases, open up new viewpoints, and foster a richer understanding of the media landscape. As cultural critic Neil Postman advised, quote, we need to cultivate a new kind of cognitive discipline, one that includes a sense of play, of irony, and of skepticism. Number 8, stay updated. The media landscape is ever evolving. New platforms, technologies, and narratives emerge quite frequently. Continuous learning, staying updated with the latest in media trends, tools, and technologies is, of course, crucial. In the words of Malcolm X, quote, the media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and make the guilty innocent. And that's power, because they control the minds of the masses. End quotes. Number 9, foster curiosity. Always ask questions. Why is this story being told? Whose voices are included and whose are left out? What's the historical or broader context? Curiosity doesn't just lead to knowledge, it cultivates wisdom. Albert Einstein's timeless words resonate deeply here. Quote, I have no special talent. I am only passionately curious. End quote. Number 10, empower yourself to create. Media literacy isn't just about consumption. In our digital age, each one of us is a creator, a storyteller. By understanding media's inner workings, you are better equipped to craft your narratives, to add your voice to the global conversation. As Tim Rosenstiel, an American journalist and executive director of the American Press Institute, said, quote, the future of media will be more about the empowerment of individuals, end quote. In summing up, it's important to remember that media literacy isn't about fostering cynicism, but nurturing informed skepticism. It's about equipping ourselves with the tools to not just survive, but thrive in our media-saturated world. So as we reflect upon January 6th and the broader challenges and opportunities of our age, let's not forget the immense power that resides within us. The power to discern, to question, to connect, and to change. In embracing media literacy, we embrace not just a set of skills, but a worldview, a commitment to truth, and a pledge to make our world a little more informed, a tad more compassionate, and infinitely more connected. And that, my friends, is the final word up front. I'm Sean Samehart, and this is Coup Save America. And joining me in just a few moments is Ben Hamilton. Now, Ben Hamilton is a history teacher who has snapped, in his own words. He was on the ground on January 6th and interviewed many of the key players and individuals in the crowd. And he's going to offer us some very unique perspectives on January 6th and just what that means for our nation's history. He is also the founder of Chasing History, and we're going to be talking about that project as well. So friends, stay with us. We'll be right back after the break. Hey, welcome back. My guest today is Ben Hamilton. He is the co-founder of Chasing History and the author of a book that I'd like to put up on the screen. Sorry, guys, we stormed the Capitol. There we go. Eyewitness Accounts of January 6th. Now, the first question I want to ask is, what brought you to the point where you decided that you wanted to go to January 6th? Do you have any kind of sense that this was going to happen when unfold?
I did have some idea that there was this intangible social pressure building up, and it might explode in some interesting ways soon. Like, I didn't have any idea that anything specifically was going to happen that day, but like, I'd been driving around the country, up and down the East Coast, living in a van, which is actually a character in the book. I named the van the Beast. And I went to all of these Trump rallies, and I went to as many other things as I could, too. There were some BLM rallies. I snuck past the police line at a Biden rally just because they were so mysterious, like no one was ever allowed in. So I tried to get a sense of what was happening in the culture in those moments, because I did think something interesting might be about to happen here. So I was trying to write a book about the whole time period. I'd been going to Trump rallies every week, like some kind of concert groupie. And then one of those days, one of the events I went to try and document, January 6th happened. And I'm like, well, obviously this is the book. Like, once I had seen that and was witness about that, I was like, well, I'm going to focus on this one day for my book. But I have piles of notes from interviews I did with people for months before that and a bit after that could easily make 3 more books. I was trying to study the whole time period, and I just got lucky, and this really interesting happened while I was in the process of that. That's kind of the purpose of the Chasing History project. And also, I should mention, Chasing History is actually a book by the great Carl Bernstein that came out the day after I published my book. So I got to be careful. I don't want to get in like a copyright battle. I don't own the rights to the title Chasing History. I'm the Chasing History project. I put and that's the website too, since I'm mentioning it. So just that clarification. So I was bugged for a second because I felt like Carl Bernstein stole my title, because that's the title of like the book series. But then I thought maybe it was a good thing. Maybe the kind of people who are Googling books by Carl Bernstein would like my book anyway. But yes, so to get back to your original question, I felt like I've got some like sections in my book where I go into it. I felt almost like my civilization was like collapsing, and that I wanted to write a book documenting that history students in some future generation would read. Like, this would be the thing that high school students in class get when they're studying, why did America collapse? And like, I'm never quite sure whether I'm joking about that. Like, I think it's easier to laugh about than to cry about.
Yeah.
So I set out in that time period to document things. I also managed to get myself more or less in the middle of that thing in Seattle when the protesters had taken over several blocks of the city, and that went on for weeks. That's going to be the next book. I haven't released that one yet. But so the Chasing History Project is kind of a series in which I just try to get an on-the-ground sense of what maybe history students of the future might want to know, as best as I can guess.
Well, when that next book comes out, I hope that you'll join us again, because we're based here in Seattle, our station, and my producer actually visited what you're talking about. What was it? The DMZ zone that
they changed the name several times, and this is one of the things. As a progressive, I mean, I get more annoyed with them every year, but I'm more aligned with the progressive than anyone else. As a progressive, they always rename things. They're obsessed with renaming things, and they just take it too far. So that area, it went through a bunch of different names. The most famous was the Chaz. I was really only there for the last week, and it was about 3 weeks, and during the last week it was known as the Chop. So I'm tentatively going to call that book "History on the Chop," where because I love to because I was thinking about a lot of the things that were in your monologue, and another thing that motivated me to do this was I have a sense that I just don't trust the news anymore. I think a lot of people don't. I think the people who still do are in the minority. So when there was news that something crazy was happening in Seattle, and I can flip on one channel on the TV and it says there's riots and they're burning police cars and there's armed people checking, entrances and exits. And then another one that describes it as a mostly peaceful protest. And I found myself wondering, what's really happening? I would love to get there and see for myself. And so that's kind of what drives me to do the things I do, to write the books I write, is whenever there's something that it looks like people will be debating about, even after it's over, I want to see it for myself, if at all possible, to find out what really happened.
Yeah, you describe yourself as the history teacher who snapped, and I can certainly understand that, because, look, I'm in the same place that you are. I look at the news and I just don't trust any of it. It's polarized, it's profit-based, and so much of the information comes directly from, the intelligence agencies, or if you look at MSNBC, nearly all the experts they have on there are former CIA, FBI, whatever. I mean, these used to be what the institutions that journalism would be very cynical of.
Yes, that used to be their job, was to criticize all these alphabet soup people, the CIA, the FBI. Suddenly, people think the CIA is like the hero of the story. When did that happen? Even when I was a kid, 20 years ago now, but still, I'm not thinking back to the wild 60s. Even in the 90s and early 2000s, the media was critical of the CIA. The media, there was an understanding that the CIA does awful things and we should call them out for it. And that just doesn't happen anymore.
No.
What you said it's a great segue into something that I made sure that I stressed in the book, which is, first of all, I should say a few things that people always kind of want to know, just to make sure it's clear. There were a lot of criminals in January 6th. I absolutely interviewed people who told me they didn't seem to think of it as confessing a crime, but they confessed a crime to me. They told me that they'd pushed their way into the building while Congress was in session and punched police officers while inside. Those people are obviously criminals, and I hope they are all caught. But the media took this crime that happened and spun it and twisted it to fit different narratives. And the liberal narrative of this being some sort of well planned out insurrectionary coup, I just didn't see it. And the fact that the media told things that were clearly lies. If in the book, there's a section where I go over some of the most iconic pictures from the day that just were published. And there's the guy who had zip ties who the zip tie guy. It was an iconic figure of like a guy walking through. There was some 24-hour news cycles of talking about how the guy clearly had been planning to kidnap the members of Congress because he brought zip ties with him. But eventually, even his own prosecutors in the trial admitted that he found the zip ties inside. The police just dropped them, and he picked them up. So that was not difficult information to get, but the media didn't say that. They wanted the
Right.
snappier narrative. And like the fact that they cut corners like that. I mean, there's an even better one I've got. Like they claimed that a police officer was beaten over the head with a fire extinguisher and died, was slipped in a coma and died shortly after. That was widely reported. The New York Times said that. It was mentioned as evidence in Donald Trump's impeachment. And it turns out it was completely made up. Like that guy died, but he went home after January 6th. He texted his family, told them he was fine. He slept in his own bed, and he died later. Eventually they determined it was a stroke, almost certainly in relation to stress. But the point was that like this guy's body lay in state. Like members of our government who write laws were forced to walk past this guy's dead body and told he was beaten to death in that room, and he wasn't. Like, no, do you mind if I read a section of my book
No,
about that?
please go
Yeah.
ahead.
Okay, yeah. So, I highlighted this while I was listening to you talk. I said, the bottom line is this. When your society forces members of Congress to walk past a dead body on display in the center of the Capitol, but nobody bothers to call that guy's family and ask what killed him, it speaks to a deeper issue. It speaks to a culture where narratives are pushed so enthusiastically that accuracy is a distant afterthought. These are not people I trust to leave accurate history lessons for future generations. That's why I decided to do it for myself. So, what you were talking about reminded me of that section of the book. I think it's important.
A lot of I consider myself to be a socialist at this point. Because the word progressive has kind of been diluted. But a lot of my progressive friends and a lot of people on the left are convinced that January 6th was an insurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And they repeat these stories that you're talking about. I mean, the guy with the zip ties. Now, again, look, there were, like you said, there were absolutely criminals and crimes that were committed on that day.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like, and I think I said in the book, like, obviously, breaking into the Capitol building and finding zip ties inside is still illegal. Like, do I even need to say that? Like, apparently, I need to say that. But accuracy matters. If the media and the government are telling you things that are not true, that's important. It's not like they're not like allowed to tell lies so long as the lies are in the right direction. One of my heroes, Matt Taibbi, is often making that point. Like, people nowadays seem to think, well, if the lie served a good purpose, let's see, at least they were lying on my side. That's not okay. Not, the consequences of that are profound. Like, as a guy like me who believes in history, you can only ever really understand what happens. You can only ever know the big picture if you fit together the small pictures, and then the pattern emerges. If all the little details, if every bit of information you get is a lie, you're never going to be able to get a broader understanding. It's terrifying from the point of view of history, and that's to say nothing of people having trust in their government or their media.
Well, one of the things that I found remarkable about Donald Trump is how often he would actually speak the truth. And what I mean by that is not even that he was intentionally telling the truth. Like when he said, there's alternative facts. Yes, there are. And we need to come to terms with that. Alternative facts are basically the result of people who have different perceptions. And those perceptions are largely manufactured by the mainstream media, by the different institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And Donald Trump really revealed, and again, this was very unintentional, I'm sure, the systemic cracks that the truth has and just how fragile it really is. And now what we're seeing is just an outright attack on history altogether. I mean, literally, you've got members of Congress and state and officials that are quite intent on rewriting history to a certain narrative. That has to frustrate the hell out of you.
Yeah, it does. It's funny. I like I said, I was briefly actually a campaign manager for the Democratic Party, like, small local elections, but I also did some internships. So like when I was in college 20 years ago, I was a true believer in the Democrats, and so I gradually kind of became worn out. That was why I took my background, my degree in political science, and I decided I think I'm just going to teach social studies instead. I dropped it, but my first purpose with that education was to try and become like a professional campaign manager. So all of it is to say, I tend to just be more viscerally disappointed in the Democrats and the progressives and the socialists because I perceive them on some level still as my team. I'm like, come on, guys! Like, I expect that of my enemies, but you're supposed to be the ones who are good at this. And I think that's an attitude that is notably missing from the liberal movement nowadays, of calling out the people on your team. So for Hook or Crook, I tend to feel more strongly about that. Now, I don't want to come out here being pure just anti-left raging on when I'm here to talk about January 6th, because there's definitely on that day a lot more bad actors on the right than on the left. So do you mind if we talk about Trump a little bit then? Trump that day?
No.
I think it's
it's definitely relevant.
Okay, yeah. I think I don't want to be rude. I'm not sure if you're
No.
what your expectations are, but I think the thing that I often say, and one last time where I'm going to have to get my left-leaning friends angry at me, is I'm going to have to clarify that I saw that speech from beginning to end. I took notes on that speech. Donald Trump did not say, "Now go commit violence and overthrow democracy." That did not happen. And a lot of people seem to think that happened. Nothing that cut and dry happened. That's a lie. But I don't think he was a good actor. Like, I think there is an accurate case to be made against him. First of all, he spent like over an hour giving these very specific numbers that appear to have been made up, quote unquote, proving voter fraud. He said things like, there were 83,791 dead people who voted in Michigan. There were 72,803 dead people who voted in Ohio. And he went like almost state by state. It actually got boring, and like, it wasn't just dead people. He was saying like the dates didn't line up. Like, people said that they mailed in their ballot before they ever received it. He had all these very, very specific accusations, and he listed no sources. Like, as a history teacher, as one of the first things I teach my students is like, what is your source? Where does the information come from? But he just threw the numbers out there. And I have never heard, I've never heard a convincing explanation of where he got those numbers from. But the people in the crowd, they believed that. This goes back to the idea of faith. Like, Trump had a record of kind of like calling bullshit on the mainstream media. There was a few things that he did that he turned out to be true. And people, like the example I gave earlier, they know there were times that the media lied to them. They've all seen examples of it. So they got this guy who they've decided they trust, Donald Trump, who is, by the way, the president of the United States, the sitting president of the United States. He tells them the election was stolen. These are numbers. They believed that, And so the people started leaving his speech early. I'd never seen that happen before. And all the times I saw him speak, he always had the crowd in the palm of his hand. He was quite a performer. He was incredible. It was almost like some sort of like stream of consciousness art form more than it was a speech, but it was engaging, whatever it was he did. But today people got bored. Or it's not just they got bored also. I should clarify. They started pointing out to each other that they had come to protest and hopefully stop the certification of the election. And the certification had started. Like, Trump talked too long. Like his speech was way longer than it was supposed to be. We were a few blocks away from the Capitol building, and so people just they'd listened to him, they'd heard enough, and they started leaving without him. Like he had promised at the end of my speech, we're going to march down to the Capitol building, but he hadn't made any really clear plans for how to like handle the march. Like I was a political activist. I know what a march is supposed to look like. There's supposed to be a guy with a clipboard who tells you where to start and where to stop. There actually, honestly, there's supposed to be like it's one of the strangest things I noticed, but I think this gets to the heart of me trying to explain how it felt to be on the ground at some time. There were no porta potties. Like there's always that in giant marches. Like so, the planner has set up porta potties everywhere. There was nothing. So like his vague idea was when I stopped speaking, you're just going to walk down a few blocks, and to send this crowd of God knows how many people. Like I think the estimates of that day are small. Like that was the biggest crowd I've ever seen. I've been to giant crowds. I've protested the Iraq War. That was the biggest crowd I'd ever seen. So I would say 1 million people. I'm not professionally qualified to say that, but it was huge. And his plan was just to have them walk down a few blocks just with no clear supervision. Like he actually turned out the one guy who was supposed to lead it was the guy from InfoWars. What was his?
Alex Jones.
Alex Jones. Yeah, Alex Jones' job was supposed to lead the march. Trump had asked him to, but the people started leaving before the speech was over, and so Alex Jones was still just sitting there watching the speech. And it's also kind of ridiculous to have one or maybe one guy for this huge number of people. So I would say, like I argued in my book, that seems to me like that's some kind of criminal negligence, if nothing else. Like putting together a giant. I think it's fair to call them an angry mob. At a certain point, they were very angry. He was telling them things that made them very angry, and then telling them to walk across the city and then peacefully protest. Like he told them to peacefully protest. I don't know that I can claim that that was some sort of master plan he had that like, oh, I'll have said peacefully protest when really they committed violence. But he was definitely a bad actor. Like that was negligence at best. And so these people left without him. And so they were totally unsupervised. And those are the people who started fighting with police and eventually ended up overrunning the police and running into the Capitol. And that's what really happened. And I've never heard that widely reported on either narratives. Like Tucker Carlson wanted to claim that it was totally peaceful. That's kind of ridiculous. Like I was there, I interviewed people who left the building. Oh, people often want to know if I entered the building. I did not. I went right up to the building. There was actually a moment where there was like a rush of people just surging into the building. I described it as almost like if you pulled a plug in a bathtub and the people were the water. They almost looked like they were getting sucked into a broken window, which is weird because some of the doors were open, but whatever. They were climbing into a window. So the crowd was pulling me in, and I'm thinking, should I go in? Like, this is really exciting. This will make for a great book. This will make it really interesting. At the last minute, I was like, this is a bad idea. And I stepped aside. So that was the line I decided not to cross. So that was how far I myself got. But after that, people were still running in while I was there. And I interviewed people like as they left and asked them what they did. And I heard wildly different stories. So some people insisted that they hadn't punched or kicked anybody. They were just playing football. They were just shoving police officers out of the way. The guy who said that, he seemed to think that made it okay. He was like comforting, like, we didn't punch anyone. We were just pushing. We were just playing football, And then like a few guys later, the guy said, oh, I punched a bunch of cops. I kicked, And there was like another guy who told me, I just kind of wandered in, looked at the statues, decided to leave. No one tried to stop me. So there were obviously some pockets of violence and some pockets of peace. It was not like some hour-long battle, as it is sometimes portrayed. But Tucker Carlson also cut out the images of when it was peaceful. There was some violence.
No, absolutely. You mentioned Tucker Carlson, and I wanted to ask you about that. He has been accused of manipulating a lot of footage. For instance, one of I can't remember the guy's name, but there was a key player, another one that went viral, who we were told broke into the Capitol, engaged in all these crimes, and Tucker Carlson found video footage of the police escorting him all around.
I'm familiar
Now-
with this. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well,
I'm familiar with this case. I believe you're talking about the QAnon shaman, as they called him. He's actually a theme in my book. I talked to him for a few seconds before anything happened, so it's just more of an interesting little oddity. He didn't have time to really say too much, but I do have a video of me talking to him. That's one of the things I have on my website that makes it cool, little pieces of history. And then everyone kept talking about him all day, like the guy with the horns. Everyone was sharing pictures of him. They went viral instantly because he had such an interesting costume, and he did make it all the way to the Senate chamber. So I've seen some other videos as well, which I've sourced them in my book, of some journalists who were filming when they were in there, and that seems very clear to me. Let me back up a minute. I think one thing to understand is the police were just totally outnumbered. It was absolutely hopelessly outnumbered. It's debatable how many people actually entered the building, but the march, what I called, and a lot of people called, the Sea of People. It's interesting. We all sort of spontaneously came up with that name, the Sea of People, behind us, who had been at Trump's speech and then walked across the city. They were all. It looked plausible that they were all going to go in. Like, it looked like it was just one mob. There's just several blocks down. Everybody's moving forward. You get to the front of the building, you keep going. That was the sense a lot of people had. So I saw the videos. These aren't my videos because I didn't go into the building, but I've seen videos of the QAnon shaman. Like, anytime the police said, like, could I please get you to leave here? Like, he said things, we got 4 million people outside, and like kind of there was that intimidation, and that was a very real factor. The police only really got rough with the people inside the building when the people outside the building dispersed and went home. That was another key element of that day. That was, I think, maybe the big turning point. Up until that, the police were, I think you can make a very strong case that, stupid with the planning. I put a lot of blame on the mayor of Washington, D.C. She had an offer to take in reinforcements from the National Guard, and the night before, she published a letter in the newspaper, like, denouncing that idea. Because you got to remember, this was still very peak George Floyd period. And so saying, we don't need more police, that was popular with Democratic politicians back then. I think if she'd taken those volunteers, probably everything would have been fine. I really think that they only barely got in. They were kind of pathetic. Most of them. Okay, some of the militia guys were a little scary, but a lot of the people were kind of pathetic that I talked to. And like 12 hours later that day, the next day when I returned to the Capitol building to gather more material, there was a very sturdy fence that had been erected around the Capitol. It took them 12 hours. I think if they'd put up that fence the night before, really, no one would have gotten in. And I also, like, there are media reported, I sourced it in my book, that there was an order that they were not to open fire. The police were under orders not to open fire. I think people have debated who gets blamed for that order, but it's acknowledged that the order existed. So with all those stupid lacks of preparations were in place, once this starts happening, the police, they had a very bad hand. I think, they played a bad hand as well as they could. They shot off all of their tear gas. They ran out very quickly. And at that point, they're like, under orders, really all they can do is like punch people. I saw a couple of videos of the police trying to punch people, and like they weren't even phased. There was just so many of them, So that initial skirmish where the police fell back, realized that they couldn't keep the building safe, gave out the word, hey, evacuate Congress because we can't keep people out. And at that point, the police are just kind of standing there with these people who are just milling about. Like they're like, hey, we're friends now, right? Back the blue is a big part of our political program. We love police. Do you love us back? And the police, it makes total sense that the police would be like, yes, I do love you back. Sure, we'll go with that. I don't have much trouble buying that interpretation. Now, I should add, and again, this is sourced in the book, there are absolutely police officers who put on MAGA hats, started giving tours, started getting really into it, were having fun with it. There were officers there who did that, who gave the clear impression that they were on the side of the mob. That's a real thing. They didn't make that up. But once, and then again, to be fair, Donald Trump is the reason this ended. He eventually sent out a tweet telling people to go home, and then the sea of people just evaporated. And so the idea that the mob might have backup went away, and Congress was safely evacuated, so they didn't have to worry about their safety, and reinforcements finally arrived. At that point, the I disagree with your methods, but I respect your message period of the evening ended, and the police just kind of shoved them all out, and the crowd felt betrayed by this. Like maybe I'll make myself stop after this detail, because I can just go on forever. I mean, I literally wrote a book about this. I find it fascinating. Was that as the reinforcements with, you know, the shields and more flashbangs were shoving people back, the crowd started videoing the police. They seemed to think they were capturing police brutality. And as soon as they showed these videos of how cruel the police were, everyone would be on their side and would be angry at the police. Like that was the mentality that so many people were viewing this through.
Well, you know, part of the problem is, and I guess when we talk about criminal culpability, about the people that were there that day, some of them I think have gotten extraordinarily disproportionate sentences for what they're accused of doing. That said, you touched upon this earlier too. They believed that they were doing the right thing. As foolhardy as that might be in their mind, and as you said, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, was telling them these numbers, getting them riled up, getting them angry. In their minds, of course, they weren't committing crimes. They were being patriots. They were defending, you know, democracy, I guess, if they want to call it that. In that respect, I mean, and your book really touches upon that in a way, in that these people really do feel like they were victims, and they were reacting in a way that was totally rational and, in their mind, therefore illegal.
Yeah. Well, legal is a specifically defined word. You know, you can be in the right and still be illegal. You know, like what Martin Luther King did was often illegal. In fact, I was flashing back, getting back to the idea that one of my missions is to try and let people know how it felt to actually be there when something was happening. There was a period of time when I was there on the balcony when it seemed like they were winning, like that, you know, they were actually going to get what they wanted, which for someone was to delay the certification of the vote, you know. And I kept flashing back on my past as an activist protesting the Iraq War in Washington, D.C. I had walked through those same streets with a similarly sized crowd of people waving signs. It felt very similar. And like earlier in it, especially before I had figured out that they'd stormed the Capitol, it took me a little while to figure out that's where the action was. There's a section of my book that it's almost, I thought it was funny. The chapter was funny. I guess people don't see the joke, but like I'm trying to find what the most interesting story is that day, unaware that people are. But I thought, like, this feels kind of like one of those historical events, like Martin Luther King's march. And just so I'm clear, when I say Martin Luther King broke the law, I meant when he did sit-ins and was arrested and went to jail. The march was not illegal, but it felt like a connection to those events. And I thought back, you know, our Iraq War protests, they didn't really work. We didn't really end that war. maybe we should have broken into the building when we got to the end of the march. Maybe this is actually a good strategy. Maybe this is the best way to really shock the government into listening to you. Like in hindsight, obviously that is not true, but like when I was there, I was getting kind of a contact high from them. Like I was feeling like this euphoria, like, you know, all this time I've been putting up with this shit and I'm finally doing something, damn it. And there was a relief in that. So
yeah, and that's where I think it gets messy when we start using words like insurrection, like the media. Because, I mean, come on, it was not and if it was the worst attempt at an insurrection in the history of insurrections.
Yeah, I agree. And you notice the media stopped saying that. They've switched over to calling it the Capitol riots. For several years, they were shoving that Capitol insurrection narrative, and now the narrative has changed to, I think, a more provable term, Capitol riots. Like I had a long conversation with a friend of mine who was a photojournalist who was doing the same thing I did. He was also there. And we were like, what's the day after, we were trying to decide what it was. And we were like, was it really a riot? I mean, I went to buy hot dogs at one point during it. Like it, you know, for a lot of it was pretty calm. There's definitely some violence. So there was some violence, and then a lot of it was not violent. Would you call it a mostly peaceful protest then? Like, would it qualify as that term? Like, having watched it, like, and then like a random person we didn't know just started yelling at us. Like the woman, like, who we didn't know, just she heard us describe it as a mostly peaceful protest, and she just started yelling. Like, she was so pissed that, like, I would take that term and apply it to that event. It was heresy. But so it's hard to say exactly what it was. I think I've settled on angry mob as I think fair to everyone involved. I think riot is totally defensible. Like, they were breaking windows, people got hurt, they didn't kill anyone. Like, the people who died were killed by the police, and I don't feel bad about that. There's a woman who broke into the Capitol building, was running around while Congress is in session. That's their job. They're supposed to kill her. I think it's a miracle more people didn't die. So I'm not like on the bandwagon that it's so horrible that the police killed someone. But I do think it's worth noting that the crowd did not kill anyone. You know, but you call it a riot, call it a mob. It was not a legal gathering. You know,
the mainstream media though would have you believe that the crowd killed at least at this last I remember was 6 police officers.
Yeah, and that's not true. Like, I did my homework on that one. There was one person who had like I've heard it described as a stroke or a heart attack or a drug overdose, and then who was in the crowd. And then the police, they did not kill any police. There was a guy who died the next day of a stroke, who for a long time, the New York Times and many other media outlets said died of a blow to the head, and a lot of people still believe that happened. It didn't happen. And then there was police who committed suicide over the course of the next year, which I find fascinating, but I have not researched that. I don't really know what the story is with that, but they certainly weren't killed on January 6th by the crowd.
Yeah, and this is part of the problem with this misrepresentation of January 6th, is that people are not listening to people who were there. Or, let me back that up. There were journalists there that were covering it from a perspective that was wholly false. And so you've got, and again, it just goes back to that main point that you made. You lie to people once, as the media, why would they believe you when you say something different?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I completely agree. Like, it drives me crazy. Like, there were so many actual crimes committed that day and actual bad things. Why make them up? Why lie and invent fake accusations? That just makes them seem innocent when you finally get around to accusing them of what they really did. I kind of think that is, in a nutshell, what has happened with a lot of things related to Trump and politics and things in America the last few years. There's this, the media is inventing things when there were already bad things that were real. I don't get it.
Well, I felt the same way about the impeachment of Donald Trump, both times, for that matter. What they impeached him for, I was like, of all of the things that you're picking,
Yes.
these are the crimes that you're going after. And I kind of feel the same way about the indictment of Donald Trump. I am not saying that Donald Trump should not be prosecuted. What they're charging him of, that seems a slippery slope. I mean, it comes down to a free speech issue.
Yeah.
What do we actually know? Why do you think? I mean, why not charge him with inciting a riot?
I would, like, I'm not a lawyer, but I go at great detail in the last part of my book to describe like what he did, and like I draw attention to the fact that like it might be difficult to prove that he had any of this stuff planned out. I personally don't think he did. I think it was just like I called it a perfect storm of intersectional stupidity. I think he was stupid not planning the rally. My best guess, it's really hard to know the mind of Donald Trump. He's one of the hardest to understand people. So I warn people not to underestimate him because nobody ever predicts what he's going to do correctly. He's not like stupid. Stupid people are predictable. He's something else. But if I had to guess, I think he thought having a really riled up crowd protesting outside the building would look good for the cameras as he made his pitch to say that the election was stolen. My best guess, that's what he thought would happen. Regardless of that, though, he was negligent of people's safety in telling them to walk across and not providing proper supervision. And then once it started, there are pretty well documented claims of phone calls he had with members of Congress inside. Some of these stories, to be fair, I think have been recanted. There's people describing a phone call and then they took it back. They said, no, that never happened. But like of him kind of mocking the members of Congress while they're inside, said people saying, call him off. And he was like saying, well, first let's talk about that thing I wanted, then we'll call him off. That's not an exact quote, but like people can look this up. I think that's the crux of it because he understood he had the power to stop it and he chose not to. And like he finally is the one who ended it. He when he texted go home, the sea of people evaporated. Almost everyone went home. The police were able to mop up the stragglers very quickly. Once he said go home to them, the game is over. But I don't think he gets too much credit for that because once you acknowledge the fact that he had the power to do that, why the hell didn't he do it earlier? Like it seems to me there should be a crime in there somewhere. Like if there's not a crime in there somewhere, then we need to rewrite some laws because like the stuff he actually did, like it might not be enough to lock someone up for the rest of his life, but it seems deliberate. It seems knowing. There were some things he did, but like it's just like them inventing the story of a police officer being beaten to death in the Capitol. Right. That didn't happen. They also invented a story about Donald Trump giving a speech where he tells people to go overthrow the government. He didn't actually do that. So once you're on record having accused him of doing that, these more credible accusations you could make, people are less inclined to believe.
Yeah, and this is the entire problem. Now, you were there before they actually stormed the Capitol, and you did not expect that to happen. There's another narrative about January 6th that I find very compelling, and that is that there were members of law enforcement, undercover or informants or what have you, and there's video clips of these individuals riling up the crowd, and the crowd saying, Fed, you're a Fed, you're a Fed.
Yeah.
What do you think of
I was lucky enough to get some firsthand knowledge of a few of the types of events that happened that day. The like the instigator narrative is one of the ones that I feel I got the least lucky on. So I met people who were making that accusation, who said, I think that there are feds and instigators, although I spent a lot more of them after they got pushed back. When we were kind of like on the balcony and there was the euphoria, I didn't hear a lot of people saying, oh, they tricked us into doing this. They were proud of it at first. So I think that's worth noting. I think a lot of this is as the narratives developed. One thing I mentioned that I think it was actually fairly important, was at some point the phones stopped working. Everyone on the ground assumed it was a jammer. Later, I heard it was overloaded system. I don't know, but there was a period of, I don't know how long, not that long, where nobody could get any messages sort of from the outside. And so when they came back, people sort of all at once were exposed suddenly to the portrayal of them on the media and the social media that they had been shielded from for a little while. And right around that time is when I started hearing that it must have been some informant who tricked us into doing this. There's a lot of people, when they wanted to suddenly, they switched from bragging to making excuses.
Right.
And there's definitely an emotional reason to do that. Even the QAnon shaman, like a number of people that day told me like it must have been him. That guy must be a BLM activist. They were willing to throw anyone under the bus to say, the blame. Having said that, that doesn't mean there wasn't a kernel of truth. Like, I'm not saying that. I can't disprove that. I recall one guy there was something really creepy about him who was breaking windows. Like, he had I don't know, a hammer or a small club or something, and he'd climbed up, and he was incredibly mechanically, like every hit the same way, like same timing, like a robot. And tons of people around him were shouting, "Stop, we don't do that. You're a Fed, stop. And he just wouldn't stop, It's possible. I don't know. I did see there was a few people who I actually captured in the background of my audio recordings, which, by the way, anyone who wants to listen to any of the interviews I conducted in full, those are all on my website. I try to not cut any of the interviews in the book, but in the event that I had to cut parts of it, I always put the whole thing on the website. So anyone who's curious, that's my documentation. I'm sharing that. That's my history, my contribution to the record, hopefully. But in the background of a lot of these interviews, I hear people going around with a megaphone saying, like, in case you were not aware, the police shot and killed a 12-year-old girl in there. And that was the woman who got shot. She wasn't 12, but apparently she was a 12-year veteran. And so, like, through the telephone game effect, people repeated that. So there were people, that's just all they were doing. They were walking around on the megaphone trying to get people angry, trying to get them angry enough to get back inside, Like, I confronted those people directly. I was like, what did you expect? She broke into the congressional building while Congress was still in session. It's a miracle more people weren't killed, And I was the only one who was saying that to them. It didn't occur to me at the time that those people were like federal agents, but there have been, since then, my understanding is there have been reports that was happening. One other thing I'll mention is there are informants who are just members of an organization who are talking to the FBI. I find that easy to believe. I would find it pretty easy to believe that some of the militia guys were doing that. The militia guys, like I say in my book, like if you're looking for any nefarious people to make, suspicious claims or theories about, the militia people, they seem to have some sort of inkling. There was a lot of rumors I heard included that the militias were on the other side of the river with like armed reinforcements, and they were going to show up any minute now and help people hold the Capitol. Like that, a lot of people believed that. There was one guy, a guy in a pinstripe onesie, who's who was just kind of, that was his thing. He was going around saying, "We hold on, the militias are coming. Hold on," that was his like mission. I said in the book, like, is that true? Can I believe what he said? Can I believe anything a man in a pinstripe onesie said? But because that was the other thing that was like so strange about it. There was all these cartoonish costumes, like in this picture behind me. Like that's a guy dressed as a Roman emperor looking over the edge of the Capitol building on January 6th. Like this is a picture I took from January 6th. There were all these just like cosplay characters just mixing in there. It was this weird, wacky parallel reality. Like you couldn't tell what was real in that time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because there were a lot of costumes there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where that? Did you ever? Did you interview? I mean, you interviewed Jacob, the guy with the horns.
Right. I don't want to oversell it. I spoke to him very briefly.
Spoke to him. I bet you had no idea.
Yeah, but I was actually pretty lucky. Like, basically what I'm doing is like betting. I'm gambling. I'm making bets that like what will turn out to be the important stuff later, and a lot of my bets paid off. Like, I'm very grateful to the muse that like it's kind of amazing that like I talked to that guy and got a picture of him like at all. Like if I had my vote, I would have picked this Roman emperor as the symbol of the day. Like I saw him as like Nero looking out over Rome as it burned, which is just a legend, but it's a good legend. But I guess that was a little too historically specific. I guess that plays better with the history teacher crowd. But so you were asking about the costumes.
Yeah.
That was pretty common for Trump events. People, they just wore them at all the events. Yeah, they were, honestly, they were fun. Like I often, like I was a little jealous of these people who were part of the Trump movement because they were having fun. They felt like they were the good guys. They felt like they were the heroes of the story of history, and they had a sense of community. And I haven't felt that way about my political team in a long, long time. You know, I kind of envied them their naivete. I don't know if they feel that way anymore, but they had that sort of bright-eyed quality at the day of, just believing they were good, believing they were the heroes, and in the end of it's almost like this was a movie, you know, and this was the climax of the movie at our darkest hour. Surely we'll figure out something at the last minute, you know, like they seem to all really believe that. They were stunned when it didn't happen. I imagine it was traumatic in the years afterwards.
Well, yeah, it would be interesting to be able to go back and interview those same people, wouldn't it?
I've thought about it. When the QAnon shaman was in prison, I thought it might be a cool idea to do like a from prison interview. But he got out, so I don't know that he'd have any particular interest. And besides, you got to carefully consider the political implications of everything you do. But yeah, what I try to do, another way I think about what I do is like I try to imagine that you're studying a historical event years later, like in your classroom, you know, and some kid raises his hand and asks, in the French Revolution, why did the people do this, you know? And I try to just be that kid. Like when I'm interviewing people, I'm just trying to think what would like a history student who's actually paying attention and thinks this is cool, you know, what would they want to know about this weird stuff, you know, and I try to forward that on. So a lot of the questions I asked sort of had that flavor to it. I do think that in particular the balcony interviews, as I call them, when I was actually talking to people who had just left the building, I bet almost all of those people have changed their story. I bet they've fit this into a narrative more, you know, first of all, they've probably got a lawyer, you know, so they've got some way to explain that it wasn't their fault. And then they've probably told it so many times, they've probably convinced themselves of it.
Yeah.
I think the fact that I got it fresh out of the building is the closest to the truth that it's really, you're likely to get. You know, not just what they did, but like what they were thinking when they did it, you know, because I think even the people who did it can rewrite it in order to better fit the narrative that they're trying to live up to later.
Did you get
narratives
the sense
are dangerous.
That there was any regret? I mean, now you mentioned that there were a bunch of people telling that one guy, stop doing that. You know, you're a Fed, stop breaking that window. So there were obviously people there that knew that there was a line that had been crossed.
Yes. Okay. So I could answer that in two ways. So first of all, when I'm talking about the balcony, what I found fascinating is the number of people I met who believed there was a line somewhere, and they believed they hadn't crossed it. You know, like there were people kept telling me like, oh, you know, well, we're conservatives, we only do defense. We don't take offensive actions, So when the police attacked us, we defended ourselves, but we didn't attack them, and like obviously like when you enter the building, like you are the one on the team playing offense. The other people are defensively trying to protect the building that you are legally not supposed to be in because Congress is in session. Like that's but they had the story that they were telling themselves to try and make it make sense. Where like, oh, there's some, and like I heard a lot of people saying like, hey, remember everyone, this is a peaceful protest, in the midst of like broken windows and tear gas and people entering the building. They were telling each other that no, it's okay, we haven't crossed the line yet, make sure you stay peaceful. Like there was kind of part of it, I think, was like they just hadn't been to a lot of peaceful protests. Like they don't understand that once you break into the building, it doesn't count anymore. But like they seemed to, a lot of people genuinely believe that. And there were people saying like, don't break shit. I had one fascinating moment where there was an older guy who, when I was like right there next to looking in through the broken window, he looks at me and he takes this like glass case and tips it over and like, just holds it dangling there. And he looked at me like he was asking permission, like this unspoken conversation with the eyes. Should I tip it? And I was like, don't break things, man. And then he looked really disappointed and he like put it back. So I think, I think there was this like visceral, I'm sick of this shit, which I understand, by the way.
Yeah.
Like this is like the COVID lockdowns had gone on for like over a year. People had no money. They weren't allowed to go to their jobs. It was miserable fucking time. And that was just one example. A lot of things were happening at once. So I think there was this catharsis of like, I'm finally fighting back. But they were trying to make it fit into this narrative of like, I'm the good guy. I would never do the kinds of things that I hate it when BLM does, And it's like, no, you've kind of crossed that line. Like you're trying to have it both ways at this point. So I did see a lot of that cognitive dissonance. Now later, one of the like a fascinating little, like I just like the muse smiled on me that day. Like even afterwards, everything, I got to the bus station where I had parked my van, the Beast. And there was just a bunch of refugees from the day there. And so I got to interview them like a few hours later, and it just kept going. And there was a lot of regret there. There was a lot of trying to rewrite it. People were telling me, oh, I didn't want to go in. I got pushed in, which like I almost got pushed in. So I understand what they're saying, but I also didn't, like I decided not to go in and like it was possible to do that, but like they were trying to say like how it wasn't their fault, or a lot of people were saying the QAnon shaman must be a BLM plant. They even had like a viral photo they'd been shared that had been like cropped to give the illusion that he was being like supportive at a BLM rally, that he was a BLM guy. And I have the full photo in my book too. It's clearly not the case when you can see the whole photo, but like who knows how many thousands of people were sharing that. They were clinging to that like it's his fault, it wasn't us. There was a strong feeling of that. It was an amazing feeling afterwards. If I could just I just think this is worth mentioning, switching modes a little bit, if you don't mind.
No, please.
The whole city shut down. Like the curfew was in place, and once I saw the last little group of people get arrested, the entire city was black. Like all the lights were off. It was dark everywhere. The only light coming from the street lights. So there's these like red and green lights echoing in the endless darkness. And as I was walking the few blocks back to the bus station, I met like a couple like random like refugees, kind of like me. Like you couldn't call a taxi, you couldn't call an Uber. The subways were shut down. There were no hotels. I don't know what happened to all those people. Like most of those people, they were just stranded. I think they may have just slept on the streets that night for all I know. They eventually got cleared out of the bus station. You talk about catharsis. I think the police really enjoyed that when I watched the police clear the guys out of the bus station and told them they couldn't stay the night there. But I just slipped away because I had my van was already parked in the parking lot, so I had a place to stay. I had a bed in the back. But those people, they were very sad. And then I heard some truly frightening things by a few people who aren't necessarily, indicative of any larger movement. It's not a scientific poll, But I did hear some people talking about like, well, that was it for being peaceful. From now on, we need to just like find the socialists and hang them as an example to everyone. And I told the guy, because the guy, he said he hadn't eaten in 3 days. So I said, well, here's some food, or days. I don't know how many days. And so as he's eating my food, like he says, oh, we're going to kill the socialists. And I said, I'm a socialist. And I identify at least as a Bernie Sanders style socialist,
Right.
Without him missing a beat, he's like, well, then I'm going to kill you. I'm like, even though I just gave you my food, even, you're not even going to like hear me out and have a conversation. It's like, I'm going to kill you, So that was the note it ended on, not a hopeful note.
Yeah, that's disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
Well. I mean, I'm glad that he didn't kill you, but
yeah, I think he was more saying that like he's planning like a revolution where he's going to kill me and everyone like me once he gets. I'm putting words in his mouth at this point, but like it was like he was saying he wanted a civil war, and I was saying like, well, I don't think we're going to have a civil war like we did the last one. I don't think people are going to take guns and line up. And he was saying like, no, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be like, we're going to have like guerrilla war. We're going to have to find people and kill them and then run away. And, it'll be like that. So I think when he was saying he was going to kill me when that starts.
Unless you give him more food, maybe.
No, the food had no effect. The food did not help. I'd already given him food. There was no response with that. No relationship between giving him food and him wanting to kill me.
Wow. Yeah, that's a disappointing story. It's certainly not the heartwarming ending that I would have expected.
Yeah, it's not an optimistic book. I kind of, like I said, part of the reason I do all this is I mean, I've been an activist all my life. I've been trying to save the world since I was 18. And it just has kind of settled into me that I'm probably not gonna,
Yeah.
So, like, I think things are getting very bad. I think, like the Roman Republic before us, which is my favorite period of history. I love the Roman Republic because I think it's so similar to our society. I think, democracies, republics, they don't last forever. They're not very stable. They tend to collapse. We've already lasted longer than they usually do.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do everything I can to save this country, to save the ideals in the Bill of Rights, which is, I think, what makes America worth fighting for. But I've also kind of made my peace with the fact that, I'm really just I'm just shooting at this point to say I did everything I could. Like, I'm not really expecting it to work. I'm just going to say, well, it's not my fault. I did everything I could. And then I left a record of it for other people, and maybe they can learn from my mistakes. And aside from that, I'm just going to have to accept that it's probably all going to end horribly and within my lifetime. And just kind of have a sense of humor about it, I guess.
How we hear this talk about civil war a lot. We hear it from people like what you just said. The guy kind of indicating that that's what he expected to happen. We also hear it from the media. What is your sense? Is that where we're heading? Are we heading towards? I don't think that a civil war is going to happen like before either. I think it's going to be more random acts of domestic terrorism.
Yeah, well, I mean, to quote the Terminator for a second, the future is not written. Like there's any number of things that could happen. But if we're just talking about like laying the odds in Vegas, like the types of things that are likely, it's in my opinion, you see like more and more instability. Like the truth is that riots that shut down parts of a city seem to be getting much more common. They seem to be underreported in the media. That's one of the key things that people would tell me at Trump rallies that I really felt like it rang true to me. People would tell me that like their business was burned down, and they lost everything in a riot, and the media insisted that there was no riot, that it was a mostly peaceful protest. So I wouldn't be surprised if you get that, if you get the police like just kind of giving up more and more and just sort of letting people fight it out. There's the element that I'm most concerned about is the collapse of the democratic institution, the government, of it just becoming kind of a joke. The idea, I think, if we're not already there, we are to some extent. Okay,
Yeah.
it's already pretty bad, but I feel like there's a window in which we could maybe take it back, if that makes sense. But just like where like it's treated as ridiculous that the government could ever stop a giant corporation from doing anything they wanted, and all of the regulations are no longer enforced. There's more and more toxins in the water. Like you already get that in Flint, you get that everywhere. The water is never safe to drink. There's and then we seem to very much be on the brink of war, like right now. Like what's happening in Russia and Ukraine alone seems to run the risk of drawing us in, because we are in the NATO alliance, and if Russia attacks any of the NATO countries, we'd be involved. And then there's tensions around China with the Taiwan. So like there's the international front. So I'm often reminded of the period shortly before World War One. And so all these things are sort of happening at once. It can be difficult to predict like which is going to be the one thing to land. But I see a lot of potential problems over the next years. I think it's totally reasonable to, stockpile food and water and prepare to ride out some sort of rough times. I'll say one more thing. I think one of the things I keep my eye on is the power going out. There are a lot of countries in the world where the power is not reliable. They get electricity a few hours a day. They're never sure if it's going to be there or not. That's one of the canaries in the coal mine. Like if things got unstable enough for whatever reason, and I know I thought I'd stop, but like I see these kind of weird armed urban conflicts, which are again very similar to the late Roman Republic, oddly, but between these kids who have like kitted out like bulletproof vests and riot gear and baseball bats, and like they show up for the purposes of fighting each other. I saw them in a lot of different cities that I went to when I was doing this, and like they all think they're the good guys and they're there to protect each other from the bad guys. And there's all these groups that people claim don't exist, and they say, oh, I'm not them, but they looked an awful lot like Antifa and the Proud Boys and the militias. And that's I mean, last I was in the field, that seemed to be getting really out of control. There's a interlude chapter I have in my book about all the teenagers I met who had these like body armors that they just wore to events that it'd be called a protest. It would start out as a protest, but they kind of seemed to be looking to fight each other, kind of like this weird backdoor urban combat. And that could spiral out of control. So the questions about a civil war, the most likely scenario that would end in an actual civil war would be if there was a disputed election and two different people declared themselves the legitimate president and both started issuing orders, and various members of the government, some of them started obeying other orders, some of them started obeying other orders. That would actually meet the definition of a civil war. All of these things, I certainly don't think they're all going to happen. It's possible none of them may happen. Like, it's really hard to predict the future. But I do think we live in precarious times. I think that a lot of things could go wrong and could lead to some combination of these potentially bad scenarios. I think I can say that without being a kook.
How close did we come with Trump when it was questionable whether or not he was even going to leave the White House?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this, I'm far outside what I could call my area of expertise, so I'm just speculating at this point. Like I feel like I can speak with some authority on some parts of January 6th and count as a legit expert in some ways. We're just asking about what Trump would do. I'm just speculating. But I did see the evolution of a news story, one of the many things that didn't make it into the book. In Atlanta, or Georgia, wherever the capital of Georgia is. I don't know. I was driving around a lot. I had a guess that when the electors were chosen in Georgia, that something interesting might happen. The types of things I was talking about. Like there were people in riot gear, like patrolling back and forth, some of them armed, at least this was reported to me, where, there's one crowd that's demonstrating in favor of Trump. There's another crowd that's demonstrating against Trump. And these body armored people were not affiliated with the government in any way. These are just like people who showed up, it's not covered by the media a lot that I'm aware of. It's one of the things I tried to get to the bottom of. I talked to a few before January 6th, and that was one of the things that I thought maybe that was what the book was going to be about. But anyway, I was there because of that, but I somehow ended up getting swept in with all the journalists there. And I was right there in this bottom room when they created a second set of electors, which was like a pro-Trump set of electors. And those became very important later. I interviewed the people there as they were coming out, and they said that this is just because we need to legally challenge the election results to get the recount. And the judge will say there's no point in doing a recount because there are no pro-Trump electors. So even if we did get the result did change, it wouldn't mean anything. So we're just doing it for that. That's what they told me. But Trump claimed that they were like the real electors. Over time, he started coming to believe that. I think Trump looked at this as like a lawyer's issue. That's my interpretation of what he was doing. I think he thought he could get his lawyers to bully something in, and even if it maybe wasn't, technically legal or certainly had not been interpreted the laws that way in the past, that if he could just apply the right pressure, he could get the lawyers to go along with it. I don't... Like I said, it's very dangerous trying to peek into the mind of Donald Trump. I feel like I can understand John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, probably George W. Bush. I feel like I got those people figured out. I know what they do in a situation. Trump, it's so hard to say. It's because I think he makes up so much of it on the fly.
Yes.
I really think he does. A lot of it's just improv. But I don't really think Trump would want to seize power by force in the United States. I don't think he has the ambition for that. I think he just he wanted to feel like he won. And I also think he wants to whine that he's been cheated. When he first got elected, do you remember this? In 2016, he was talking about how Hillary Clinton had 2 million fake voters in California. But he just won. Why is he complaining about cheating if he just won? I think, just my pet theory, just speculation, I think he was kind of expecting to lose the first time. And he and so he had this excuse already lined up about how he didn't really lose, they cheated, there was voter fraud, just to save his ego. I think he'd planned ahead to tell that story, and he ended up just telling it again the next time. That's, again, speculating, but that's my guess of what's going on in the mind of Trump. Now, the thing, though, to remember is Trump is important. He's powerful, not because of himself, but because he's built up a giant group of people who will follow him. And one of the last things that was said to me is that... Actually, this might be a decent place to end. Do you mind if I quote from my book again from the very end?
Oh, no, please.
Okay, and we can keep going if you want, but this would fit the narratives. Okay, so this is from the end of my conclusion chapter. So that's it. What really happened that day? Well, if you listen to the internet, behind every corner there's an evil genius who masterminded it. Trump, Antifa, the Proud Boys, the police. They were all brilliant strategists who knew exactly what would happen months in advance. But you should never bet on genius when stupidity explains just as well. When I look at that day, I see a stupid mayor who passed on federal reinforcements for cheap political points, a stupid president who told a crowd the election was stolen and then directed them to walk across the city with no noticeable supervision, a stupid crowd who believed getting inside the building would give them magic powers, but hadn't planned beyond that point. and stupid police who, despite some individual bravery, utterly failed to present a coordinated response to the obvious and predictable threats they faced. Stupid at every level. A perfect storm of intersectional stupidity. I'm sure there were some nefarious plots going on. If you want suspects, I'd say look hard at the militias who everyone said were massing armed forces. Look at whoever spread the online story that just getting inside the magic building would somehow achieve something. QAnon forums. And look at that one person who made homemade bombs. They were all probably up to something, as were doubtlessly others. Criminals abound from the event, and I hope that they're all caught. But the nefarious plotters just took advantage of the situation. They didn't create it. The event was created by our overlapping stupidity. And all the stupid people learned nothing, by the way. On both sides of the great political divide, they continued to double down on their stupid ways, doing the same stupid things that were, in the words of the guy I watched the certification with, paving the way for somebody so much worse than Trump.
Yeah, that last point is what I find most concerning. Because it's hard to say at this point, I guess. But I look at someone like Ron DeSantis as far more dangerous than Donald Trump.
I don't buy it. He doesn't have charisma. You that's the one thing you can't farm out to somebody else in politics. You can't fake it. You're not dangerous.
He's got the skills to do what Trump couldn't do, whereas Trump has the charisma.
Yeah, so Trump could hire a guy like DeSantis as a secretary or something, but I don't see him being the rallying point. But I'll tell you what I think my worst case scenario is. Like, of all of the terrible scenarios I gave you of like the horrible things that could happen, probably made me sound crazy. And also, just building off my belief, if you look at the late Roman Republic, what really killed the late Roman Republic is when Julius Caesar was assassinated. He had seized power. He had dismantled the democratic institutions. A lot of people don't even understand this, like the context. But the Roman Republic was a lot like the American Republic. Like, the founding fathers of America deliberately copied the Roman Republic. So they had separations of powers and term limits, and certain people were even elected, and the people who weren't elected were often by the people, were still elected by other bodies, checks and balances. Yeah. Julius Caesar is this guy who the rough equivalent would be like if the president can, appoint a Supreme Court justice, and the president decided, actually, I'm appointing myself Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I'm ruling that presidents don't have term limits anymore. That's kind of what Julius Caesar did. But the historians only believe the Roman Republic finally fully died when Julius Caesar was killed. Because Julius Caesar was very popular with the poor people. Yes, he destroyed democracy. Yes, he seized power, but he used the power to help poor and oppressed people. And when he was murdered, all of those people he was possible with, they rioted. They burned down the Senate House. And that would just, the government never really came back. So I think the worst case scenario is Trump wins re-election in a close election, and then shortly after is assassinated. I worry about what his followers would do after that happened, after he wasn't there to guide them, for better or for worse.
Wow. That is... Speaking of assassinations, that brings us back to January 6th, Mike Pence, where they were going to hang Mike Pence.
Yes. Yeah, so that was as I was walking with the march after the speech had ended. There was a distinct moment in which people around me were checking their phones and started shouting, "Pence betrayed us." And I think it's very significant too that I think the people noticed that there was a moment where they realized that the guy they were mad at was already in the building they were walking to. Like now they're walking there and there's a guy they're angry at inside the building. I bet that had some impact on the very first bits of violence breaking out, which, to be clear, I didn't see. I wish I'd been there to see the first punch thrown so I could lay to rest all of that. But I interviewed a lot of people about how it first started. And my understanding is it was kind of a scuffle with the police, where the people who were a few rows back were egging on the people who were in the front. So somebody would shout, "Break down the barriers," but he didn't do it. He was in the back of it. And the guy in the front would do it, and that resulted in, the police and tear gas being fired, which only made them mad. But one of the things they were mad about when they got there was Pence. Donald Trump had made some very vague calls for Pence to do something during the speech. I was taking notes on it, and I was like, I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. It's some sort of like innuendo almost. But he said something like, and Mike Pence, I'm hearing bad things. I hope you're going to do the right thing,
Yeah.
But presumably, because Mike Pence, as again, your social studies teacher talking to the audience here, as the vice president of the United States, he was also the head of the Senate, at least in the formal sense. So in a proceeding like this, Mike Pence was overseeing the certification of the election results. You often get some interesting and ironic results. Like the same thing happened to Al Gore. When he was vice president, he was forced to certify that he'd lost the election. So you often get these vice presidents in the middle of that. So Mike Pence is in there. Trump wanted him to, in some way, do something. Most charitable reading of it is he wanted to delay certification in order for more like recounts to be conducted. I heard people pitching theories like that, but there was multiple theories. Whatever it was, bottom line, Trump wanted Pence to do something, and Pence did not. Pence defied Trump, which is interesting. He didn't do that all that many times, but he seemed to think this was important. And so the word goes out, Pence betrayed us, and then people were mad. That was where I kind of felt like a shift in the energy. Now, like in real life, there were already people fighting with the police, apparently, they're part of the crowd, but that was the moment I noticed, like, wait, this feels like maybe it's starting to get ugly, because people were shouting, Pence betrayed us. They were mad. And so there were chants of hang Mike Pence and things like that. I heard a lot of traitors get the rope. I heard a lot of people shouting that, talking about traitors. They were chanting in unison at various points. It was just one of the things that was cycling through, USA, USA, traitors get the rope, traitors get the rope. It was just part of that cycle. And so, like, it's fascinating to me to wonder, like, would they really have done that? Like, I met, like, one guy later who was like, this is after the police reinforcements have pushed everyone back, after it was dark. They regrouped for a minute at the monument, the Peace Monument, I think is the monument. And I met this guy who was holding a noose, and he just kept repeating it quietly. He was just like, traitors get the rope. And like I said something to him, and then he repeated it exactly the same way. Traitors get the rope. Like it was like I was a recording. It sent chills down my spine. So if I had to speculate, I think that guy meant it. I think like he actually would have done that given the chance. Just speculating, but that was the vibe I got from him. I don't know how many people really meant that, or how many were just sort of saying it. But it was there. That was an element. There were people saying that.
Now, we also heard on the news that there was like a gallows that had been set up of some sort.
I did not personally see that. I think the guy holding the noose, my guess is it was the same noose. Like the gallows got taken down. I think
And welcome back to Coup Save America. As you can tell, we've had some technical issues, and so Ben has been thankfully willing to come back on the show and finish where we left off. So I'd like to once again bring back Ben, the Chasing History Project.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming back. Sorry about the problems.
Sure thing. Now, can you see me? I'm just getting like a black screen here.
Yeah, that's all I'm
that's
getting
fine.
to.
Okay. Well, yeah, I thought we had a great conversation the first time around. I was just re-listening to the recordings of it to try and make sure I was fresh and up to date. So I think we I felt fairly good about the points we touched on. But if you have any last things you want me to wrap up, I know I got kind of cut off in mid-sentence on the last time. So yeah, just tell me what you want to talk about, and we'll wrap things up.
Well, the last question I believe I asked you was regarding Mike Pence and the gallows that
Yes.
we've heard so much about. And you had mentioned that you hadn't seen that yourself.
Right. Yeah, I saw what I believe to be the same noose from the gallows. There was a guy walking around carrying that noose uh later, and that was a creepy guy. That was one of the creepiest guys I saw. So what I can tell you happened is he was repeating the phrase that had been chanted several times. I'd heard throughout the day, "Traitors get the rope." And it was interesting because that was, I think the way I described it in the original interview is like that was one of the chants that people were just sort of cycling through. Like people would be saying USA, USA. And I was like, okay, great, that's cool. And like, "Traitors get the rope, traitors get the rope." And the whole day, like, I was like, wait, what? Like, do you mean that? Like, what is, are you trying to say? Is that like a literal rhetorical whatever? And so I met this guy and he kept repeating it. And I told him, it was one of the few times I actively sort of gave some sort of advice to the people. I was like, look, man, I think that looks bad. I think that's a bad look for you walking around with a noose. Like I'm sure you probably are just making an artistic point, but I don't think that's going to be helpful to you. Um, and he just kept repeating, "Traitors get the rope." Like I'd talk for a little while and then he'd say it again exactly the same way. "Traitors get the rope." So I I did not see the gallows when it was up. Would guess. I try to always be fair to the people I interview, all of them. I take a lot of shots at the MAGA people in this one because they were the center of the action, but I'm taking some shots at some BLM people in my next book probably. So I try to be fair to these people. I think they would say that the gallows was like an art form, like protest. I think maybe there were some people who were thinking of it that it was almost like a threat. Because remember, they think democracy has been stolen. They
Right.
believe the Democrats stole the election from them, and they're the ones responding to that in their mind. So I think you talk to some of those people, trying to be fair to them. I'm putting some words in their mouth, but they might have said that there was maybe an implied threat or just vaguely saying that, don't betray the country. I think at least some of the people felt that way. Having said that, having met that guy, having talked to him, just having like shivers run down my spine, I think like that guy was serious. Like I think there were some people who were serious when they said that. I don't want to like over sanitize the event. Like, these things did happen. It's a very difficult field to navigate because I'm trying to call out the mainstream media narratives when they said things that were demonstrably not true. Like we talked about how the media tried to say that like someone got beaten to death with a
Right.
fire extinguisher and how that guy's body lay in the state and Congress walked past it and that was just a lie. So we do live in an era where the media tells lies. But
Yeah.
there was a guy with a hangsman noose walking around there too. That's not a lie. Like I did meet a guy like that. I don't want to completely gloss over that. Like there was some creepy vibes going on from that guy. Absolutely. So I maybe.
But they didn't
Go ahead.
have the actual gallows that were set up. You just saw the noose.
I did not see that. I didn't say it wasn't there. I've seen pictures. I believe that there
okay.
was something there. I think like this was when I bumped into that guy. It was towards the end of the day. It was dark. The police had already retaken the Capitol building. Everyone had been pushed back with tear gas and shields when reinforcements finally arrived. And for a while, people This is an interesting section in my book. People sort of gathered by the peace monument. That was sort of like a fallback position. And there was sort of like a party atmosphere, kind of like I saw people like, so people were playing music. There were people who I think just showed up at, I'm speculating too much, but there were people who had this giant speaker system on carts that they could move very quickly. That I got the sense that maybe they just did this kind of thing in DC. Like they showed up where there were crowds and they played music. And people started like dancing, and I was hitting so I continued interviewing people that day. And when I was in this weird little pocket reality, I met a guy walking around with a hangman's noose, and I conducted an interview with him, and that's in the book. I did not know that like a picture of a gallows was going to become a viral image from that day. So I did not think to ask, hey, is this the same gallows that was the same noose that was on a gallows? And what was the deal with that gallows? Were you serious? So you get what you get. I make my best guesses, but my interview with the guy who was walking around carrying the noose is in the book. It's also on my website in full. I'm trying to make sure I become a better businessman and remember to plug how cool my website is. You can hear the full interviews I conducted with everyone I did audio recordings on the chasinghistoryproject.com. So I can't speak with the same level of expertise on the gallows viral image that I feel comfortable on speaking of some of the other things that I witnessed with myself. I just touched that. But it does seem to be that there was something built that day. It got taken down or abandoned when the police took over that area, and that guy fell back carrying the noose. That's my best guess on what happened.
Now, did you feel at any point during the day threatened or in fear of your personal safety?
Yeah, there were a few. I don't like show up to events with a bulletproof vest that says press on it. So I'm able to be treated as if I'm one of the guys. I try not to deliberately mislead people. Like early in this process, I experimented with wearing a MAGA hat, and I decided it felt dishonest to me, so I took it off later. So I don't explicitly say I'm with them, but I don't look like the enemy. Like I interviewed people, again, guy in the book, who bragged about smashing the media equipment. Him and a group of other people, they broke all the cameras and things. So I am not surprised if like the mainstream journalists felt threatened that day. I don't think they're making that up. I think there was legit destruction of property and a feeling that maybe worse might happen to other people. The worst I got myself, at least that I can recall off the top of my head, was the very, very end of the book. There's this little extra chapter because after the last few people seemed to be arrested, and I felt like the police are just going to arrest everyone left standing here. I need to get out of here myself, I fell back to the bus station where I had parked my van, the Beast, that had a bed in it. And there were like refugees, like other people who had come from there also. And I interviewed them. I got like some thoughts on what had happened just a few hours later. And there was the guy who said he was going to kill me there, but I don't think he meant in that moment. I mean, like he wanted to kill me in the event that the revolution came. I think we had maybe already talked about that. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That was the guy that you gave food to.
Yes. I gave him the first food he'd eaten in days, and while he was eating my food, I told him I identified as a socialist, and so then he said, "Well, we're going to kill you then." But to be fair, I try to have a little sense of self-deprecation. I don't ever want to be accused of cutting things together in a misleading way, even if it makes me look better or worse. The very next interview, like the guy I talked to after that, he maybe called me out on something. He said, "Yeah, I think you like seeing yourself as a victim, and you were hoping he'd say something to you so you could complain about being a victim to him." And that was this oddly insightful thing. I was like, maybe I do that. And you can read the whole book. I try not to cut things out like that.
No, and that's one of the things that I love about the book, and the website too, because you're very transparent.
Thank you. Thank you. To the question of danger, like just having been through the whole event, I absolutely think that there was violence happening. I absolutely think there was a possibility with things going just a little bit different. The violence could have been significantly worse. I don't think this was a peaceful group of people. They said they were. It was weird. I kept hearing people shout, like, now remember, this is a peaceful protest. People were telling each other that. They believed that. And then I interviewed people who were bragging about punching police officers, and they didn't see a contradiction there. So, like, I don't want to come off as if I'm defending these people who committed these crimes and had these deluded beliefs often that I spoke to. But I do want to correct as much as I can some of the inaccurate things that have been said about them. It's just trying to find the accurate record.
Right. Did you see anybody with weapons that day?
Very good question. Very good question. I did not see anyone like brandishing firearms. There was a narrative that happened. I never saw that. But I did see a lot of weird, like, improvised weapons that had, at least in their mind, some sort of like plausible deniability. Like, I described them in the book. I created a word for it because I saw it so many times. I called them flag clubs. They were like flags mounted on an unnecessarily thick pole, like very, very thick, obviously like a good club that you could beat someone with. I saw a lot of people showing up in body armor, people wearing helmets, people with like these thick, leather gloves, gas masks. It was a ragtag, almost like secondhand kit. I'm trying to remember what I called it. It looked like a Boy Scout from a post-apocalyptic wasteland, like these weird non-matching sets of things that were vaguely related to danger. So there was definitely some number of people who had some level of foresight that violence was at least a possibility. I interviewed one guy who indicated that he'd left some sort of message to his mom saying he thought he might die here. But I was not able to find anyone who had any clear idea on what exactly they were supposed to do. There seemed to be some idea that getting inside the building is a goal, but nobody knew what to do after that. Like, it was, I think, one theory I have is there was this idea that they were going to show up and someone else was going to tell them the plan, and they were just ready for anything. So, like, I'm going to bring my body armor and I'm going to sneak in a club, and then I'll see what I'm told to do. And maybe someone will tell me to use it. But then they didn't get instructions. Like, Trump didn't tell them to do anything. None of the online personas, like Q was the popular one at the time, told them to do anything. So you definitely have these people who showed up prepared for some kind of trouble with some knowledge that, some bad thing might happen. But I do not see anyone I talk to that had an idea of what to do after getting into the building. It was just step one, storm the Capitol. Step two, America is saved. So, like, a lot of the people I talked to, I would say more than half, they seemed like idiots to me. Like, they seemed kind of pathetic. Like, I think it's kind of embarrassing that this pathetic band of people chased Congress from the Capitol. I think people find it comforting to imagine that this was this giant, scary insurrection because it's less embarrassing. If you're gonna have your own Congress chased out of their building, it's better that at least be like a serious group of people rather than a bunch of losers. So there's a lot of things to understand, and I think there were nefarious people in that day. I think the militia people were especially creepy. Like, if you wanted to make an argument that somebody showed up with a plan to do an actual insurrection, I think those would be the guys I would point the finger at. And a lot of them are in jail for that now. That sounds about right to me. Like, I wasn't their lawyer. I don't know all the details. I'm not surprised that those guys, you could make that stick. But there's this perception in the media and the public that the whole crowd was like that. And I think that is inaccurate.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I wasn't there, obviously, but, I've there's other journalists, for instance, with I don't know if you're familiar with the podcast, the news station Status Coup.
No.
They actually had a journalist that was on the ground there that day as well. A lot of the footage ended up getting sold or licensed like CNN into the mainstream news media. And he was actually trapped in the tunnel, one of the tunnels, when they were ramming in the doors to the Capitol.
Like, you mean the tunnels between the buildings? You mean like the hallway?
It looked like a tunnel to me, but it could have just been a hallway.
Okay.
But this was when they were trying to smash in through the doors, and it looked like they were in a. It might have been a hallway, but it was very weird. And yeah, that's the thing, is the perception that the media has given that everybody at that event was violent. And I think that there's a lot of, you mentioned that you listened to Donald Trump's complete speech and that he instructed people to be peaceful.
Yeah, he did. In the spirit of accuracy, he did say that. He also tweeted out a couple of times telling people to stay peaceful. I don't want to gloss over that and pretend he didn't happen. That should be part of the historical record. But in almost the same breath, I always want to mention that he did some stuff. Like, he knew he could have called the crowd off, and he didn't. Like, he made it clear that, like, he tried to negotiate with them after they'd broken in the building. He could have told them, hey, don't break into the building. He did not do that. He let it happen. And also, I make the case that he lied and misled the crowd when he was speaking. He kept giving these very specific numbers, saying all these dead people voted, this 82,793, some very specific number, and he kept listing numbers forever. So it sounded very much to the people listening to him that democracy had been overthrown by the Democrats, that they had stolen the election. And for most of the people, what happened was, somewhat a result of Trump doing that, because he didn't give any sources. He didn't back up those numbers in any way that would make it at all permissible to just tell people that, on at least an ethical level. He did that. He did some stuff. But when the media accuses him of other stuff that he didn't do, people kind of ignore the stuff he did do. That he just gets off the hook for the much more provable things.
Yeah. What I find fascinating too is the fact that when he did instruct the crowd to disperse, they listened.
Yes. There's definitely a moment in my book that's maybe the biggest turning point in the whole day, when I look at what I had called the sea of people. Everyone spontaneously called it that. Just giant crowd of people. Probably the biggest crowd I'd ever seen, stretching back blocks, culminating in the lawn in front of the Capitol building. And I looked at it, it was just suddenly gone. Like, I hadn't even noticed, like, people leaving gradually. It just, I rounded the corner to interview people around the corner of the building, see what was happening over there. When I came back a few minutes later, it was gone. They had cleared out. And I was like, what happened? And I was told, President Trump told us to go home. Like, the large majority of people did go home when he told them to go home, which, okay, give him some credit for that. I think it could have gone very differently had he not done that. But once it's established that he has the power to do that, why the hell didn't he do that 2 hours earlier?
Right. Well, that brings me up to the next question, and I'm going to ask. I realize this is outside the scope of the book and what we're talking about, but Donald Trump has been indicted now 4 times. Do you foresee this group of people turning violent if he is found guilty and let alone sent to prison?
I do think that is possible, to be honest. Just, I didn't personally witness anything that could let me speak as an expert on this, but this is kind of the mission of the Chasing History Project, is me trying
Right.
to understand the time period I live in. So I feel like I'm not allowed to pass on questions like this. I think there is this really damaging myth in the enemies of Trump that if they just get rid of that one guy, everything will go back to normal, in their mind, normal. I don't buy that at all. Like, Trump is just popular because he's giving voice to this years-long sense of frustration that has been built up from people feeling like their country has turned on them. That they used to live in this place that they loved, and now it seems like their government hates them, the mainstream media hates them. I don't think they're just going to give up and go home if Trump is taken off the board. And I think the best case scenario for the enemies of Trump is to defeat Trump fair and square in an election by an overwhelming margin. I think if they did that, then they might be okay. But if there's a sense that the election was stolen again in their mind, that some like trick of prosecution, and I know people will argue that Trump is guilty. Let's set that aside for a moment. I'm just talking about the perception, how people will feel.
Right.
They will feel it was stolen again. And I think there could be a chance of violence, especially if there was like a single action to set people off, like a spark to like light the fire. Like if, for example, Trump got assassinated, he were to like suddenly die, I could see, things getting very bad. Like, we had a lot of riots within the last few years, and now we're pretending like it didn't happen. We're pretending like things didn't get as nuts as they did just during the lockdown. I think I could picture a set of events that took place over the next few years or a few more that ended in some sort of violence, civil unrest, riots. I don't know exactly what, but I'm worried.
Well, and it's looking as though the lockdowns are going to come back. And that could be another spark as well.
I agree, man. Like, people lost their businesses during the lockdowns. The small business that their grandfather started that passed on to their father, like, it went out of business because they were forced to close while the McDonald's across the street was allowed to stay open.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people are mad about these things. There is anger out there. It would be foolish to pretend that anger didn't exist. Like, I am so tired of this conversation getting deflected by people saying, yeah, well, we have to fight COVID. They're just wrong. Like, just don't even talk about that for a minute. Just consider that the anger exists at all.
Yes.
I say to all the people who would favor the lockdowns, like, you need to discuss how mad people are going to be if this happens again. Like, it would be it's insane to me. It looks almost like the government is self-destructing sometimes.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I totally think that that's what's happening here. I mean, what people don't get, and we've talked about this as well, is that Trump is a manifestation of a disease. He's the symptom. And we're ignoring the actual financial, economic, all of the problems that Trump cultivated into this rage. I mean, people are upset, and they have valid reasons for being upset.
There was a section of my book I was rereading just before we started that I thought might be relevant to what you were saying. Do you mind if I quote this?
Oh, please, go ahead.
Sure. So this is, in many ways, my favorite chapter. It's one of the few things I wrote before January 6th from the original draft of the book that I managed to work into the book, where I'm sort of setting the stage for what happened. And remember, I'm writing to history students in an imaginary classroom,
right,
studying our time period, 50 years from now. All right. A year before the crowd from Trump's speech swarmed the Capitol building, my civilization was dealt a crippling blow by the COVID-19 pandemic, aka coronavirus. From March to May 2020, state governments ordered lockdowns to fight the spread of the disease. Suddenly, it seemed like every school, small business, and public space in America was closed. Without a functioning economy, unemployment and poverty skyrocketed. Within 3 months, both were growing at the fastest rate since the Great Depression. I remember passing rows of rotting storefronts, every inch of their abandoned sidewalks overflowing with dirt-smeared homeless tents. Everything solid was falling apart. Even those of us who didn't get sick or sucked into poverty were prisoners in our own homes during the lockdown. There were no bars, no movie theaters, no sports, no concerts, no public entertainment of any time. If we left the house to buy food, we had to wear medical masks. No one had a face anymore. No one could smile at you. We were giant, soulless blobs with 1,000 vacant eyes. Our entire population was cut off from everything that gave us joy, and everyone around me succumbed to insanity. They spent all their time bragging about arguments they'd won on the internet with people they had never met.
Yeah, that's very powerful. You should, kind of off topic, you should do an audio version of the book. You have an excellent voice.
Thank you. That is absolutely my plan. I'm hoping to start getting it up in a few months. What I'm going to do is I'm launching my podcast, and I'm just going to read the book as the beginning of the podcast, the first 20 whatever episodes, and then keep publishing after that. So anyone who liked that little preview, follow along with me at chasinghistoryproject.com, and the podcast should hopefully be filled out, hopefully next month. Hopefully that's,
perfect.
I'm trying to get that done. That's an aspirational goal, but yeah.
Well, the book is Sorry Guys, We Stormed the Capitol, Eyewitness Accounts of January 6. Ben Hamilton. This is a book, like I said, that I had a hard time reading because it's very emotional. It takes you through a day that was particularly difficult, and it's been widely misunderstood. And books like this and projects like, the Chasing History Project, these are important because they preserve history and teach us how we can come together, analyze events, learn from the events, and hopefully learn how to do things differently. And it's a great book. It's illustrated as well. And the audio version is going to be excellent, especially with Ben Hamilton. You really do. You have an excellent voice.
Thank you.
So it'll be perfect. So where can people find you? Social media and websites?
Yes, the brand is Chasing History Project. So any sort of search you type in to most social media or podcasts, I should have a presence, and if I don't, I'll get it. So we are there's a placeholder there on Instagram, on Twitter. I refuse to call it X, on
I know.
Spotify, and all the things like that. And the website itself is chasinghistoryproject.com. There you can sign up for my email newsletter when I'll be releasing, I wrote a lot of chapters that didn't make it into the book. So those are going to be going out as bonus materials, just things that I had to cut for whatever reason, and be updated when I have anything new out. So that's the central hub, is the chasinghistoryproject.com.
Perfect. And again, the book, Sorry Guys, We Stormed the Capitol, Eyewitness Accounts of January 6 by Ben Hamilton. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. I apologize to you and to our audience for the technical issues. I'm glad that we were able to get you to come back and finish this up. And I wish you the best of luck with the podcast, with the book, and I hope that you'll even come back with the next book about, I think was Chaz, we decided was the name that you...
Yes, Chaz is the more well-known name. When I was there for the last week, it was known as the Chop. They had changed the name by the time I got there, but it was the big thing when the protesters took over several blocks of the city.
Great. Well, I hope you'll come back and talk about that book, and I'm looking forward to that book as well. So thanks again for joining us. And this has been Coup Save America. We will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.